It's another edition of the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. My name is Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. As always, joined by Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and BrownZone.com. Well, Scott, training camp is here, and this has been another really interesting week leading into the beginning of camp, hasn't it?
It really has, Bull. And normally, and I keep hating to say this, right, because we're not normal at all, but normally we'd be out watching practice, and there'd be a full buzz and a bunch of Brown stuff. Now, there's still a bunch of Brown stuff, but there's not quite the same buzz, and we're not watching practice yet just because that's how the NFL is. And, these first 4 days for rookies and then veterans are all about testing, and then it's strength and conditioning, and we're probably not going to see the Browns on the field as a unit until August 14th.
Which is still a couple of weeks away. So it'll be strange in that regard that it will be so long before we see these guys on the field. And, of course, there is no preseason as far as exhibition games are concerned. So all of that certainly will make a big impact in some form or fashion. But today we're going to get into the two players that have opted out. And that's something that's happening league-wide. We will also get into the training camp preview article that you wrote listing 5 position battles to watch in camp. And I know Coach Stefanski spoke yesterday, so we'd certainly like to get your thoughts on what he mentioned there yesterday as well. But, Scott, we will begin with the two Browns players that have opted out, Drake Dorbeck and Drew Forbes. What kind of an impact will that have on the offensive line?
Yeah, Drake Dorbeck was probably a long shot to make the roster. He's an undrafted rookie. So the focus has to be on Drew Forbes. And, number one, he was going to compete for the starting right guard job. And I think there's plenty of people that expected him to, if not challenge, supplant Wyatt Teller, who started the last 9 games a year ago. That Teller keeps the job. He started for Buffalo a little bit as a rookie in 2018, and then they traded him to the Browns for next to nothing last preseason. So I think in an ideal world, the Browns would find somebody better than Wyatt Teller, and Drew Forbes impressed a little bit last year in training camp. Then he had a knee injury, came back, only played, I think he appeared in 1 game. But there was some upside considered there. And for him to opt out, just from a grand perspective, these players have difficult decisions, right? They're putting themselves in harm's way, just the nature of the sport. And if you have medical concerns at home, if your family has medical concerns, each player has to make what can be a difficult decision. And, I'm sure Drew Forbes looked at this year as a chance for him possibly to win a starting job, to establish himself in the NFL. So for him to opt out means he has serious concerns for whatever reason, right? We don't know. I haven't talked to Drew. But I think you're seeing guys around the league opt out. There's still time for players to opt out. I wouldn't be stunned if another Browns player or 2 or 3 opted out, but we haven't had any do with any others to this point. But I think it recasts how right guard looks. Wyatt Teller will now try to fend off, Nick Harris, the 5th-round rookie from Washington, who's better at center but could play guard. You have Willie Wright, and maybe Chris Hubbard. He was right tackle last year. The Browns signed Jack Conklin. He's going to be a bench guy, and you'd think maybe he's your swing tackle. But I talked to Chris a couple weeks ago, and he's willing to try to slide into guard if the Browns ask him to do that. So maybe he enters that competition with Wyatt Teller.
And it'll be interesting to see how not only the Browns but other teams deal with this moving forward, because you could have a situation, too, where guys get into camp and then decide maybe, it isn't worth it this year. Just kind of depends on how these next couple of weeks go. They will certainly be huge at the beginning of training camp. And speaking of, I want to get into one of your training camp preview articles. We'll certainly hit on as many of these as possible as training camp continues, but you listed 5 position battles that you're really excited to watch in camp. What 5 stand out to you?
Well, I hope I remember them all. But I know I started with linebackers. And to me, and we've touched on this before, it's the biggest unknown on the roster. And it's not just one guy, right? It's the whole position. Mack Wilson looks like as close to a sure thing among the group to start as there is. But, Mack, he flashed a little bit last year. They played well for a fifth-round rookie when he had to step in for Christian Kirksey, started, I think, 14 games. But it's not like he was a Pro Bowl player. Now, Mac has huge confidence, and if you follow him on social media, he expects a huge year, and that's great, and I expect him to start. But even after Mac, even if you give, okay, Mac's going to have one of the three starting spots and be on the field 100% of the snaps because he's a good athlete and he can run and cover a little bit in nickel, who are the other two guys? Is it Sione Takitaki, a third-round pick a year ago? B.J. Goodson, they signed to a one-year deal. He's a veteran, can fit in the middle where Joe Schobert used to play, but he doesn't, at least if you look at his NFL career, isn't on the field in passing downs. So do you only play him one down and use up a starting spot and then go to Wilson and Takitaki, or Wilson and Jacob Phillips, the third-round pick out of LSU? So I think it's a huge unknown, and I will spend plenty of time watching that battle. We already talked about right guard. To me, that was always going to be a big issue. Now it's just a big issue with one less maybe candidate, right? One less guy on the pile in Drew Forbes, who opted out. I know I talked about the second tight end in the third receiver spots, and this speaks to the development of this roster under former general manager John Dorsey and then current general manager Andrew Berry. I feel like they've done a good job not only adding talent, but adding depth to this roster. And when you look at it that way, there's not a whole lot of starting spots up for grabs, right? Right guard, linebacker, and then I think I can tell you who's going to start at most of the other spots. Now, D-tackle, defensive tackle, you have Larry Ogunjobi and Sheldon Richardson, and they're both back. And they both started last year. But they were starters last year. But they added Andrew Billings, a free agent who started a bunch of games in Cincinnati. And they drafted Jordan Elliott with their first third-round pick. So there's four guys, and I know in today's NFL you rotate your defensive linemen, but it matters who starts. It matters who plays on critical third downs, who plays on, on that last fourth quarter drive when you need a stop. And it'll be interesting to see how those four kind of rank on the final depth chart. You got to give the nod to Sheldon Richardson and Larry Ogunjobi, but it would not be a surprise at all to me if Andrew Billings supplanted Larry Ogunjobi, and I love Larry Ogunjobi. I think he's a guy that the Browns should sign to an extension. He's in the last year of his rookie contract. But if Billings surpasses him, then all of a sudden you get a sense of where Ogunjobi's future is, and it might not be with the Browns, or at least, as a long-term expected starter. So you got to keep an eye on that. And then we go to the backups, and is Njoku going to still be here? And will he be the second tight end behind Austin Hooper? Or will Earl Brown or rookie Harrison Bryant or second-year man Steven Carlson move up so it's Hooper and that guy, and then, you try to trade Njoku, which there's no indication that they will, but you got to watch how training camp goes. Does Njoku mope because he doesn't get the trade that he requested in early July? And then third receiver. Is it Rashard Higgins? Does he lose the job to Donovan Peoples-Jones, the rookie, or Kaderil Hodge? There's some guys out there, and Higgins came back on a veteran minimum one-year contract, so that doesn't show a whole lot of faith from the Browns. I know a lot of fans love him, and I know he's got chemistry with Baker, but that's something to watch. And then the final one is kick returner. They signed JoJo Natson as a free agent, has experience in the league. They drafted Donovan Peoples-Jones in the 6th round. To me, those are the two guys at the top of the battle for kick returner, but Peoples-Jones gives you versatility as a receiver. He gives you versatility to cover on special teams because he's a big guy. I think he's 6'2", 212, something like that. JoJo Natson's like 5'7", 150. So he's not going to be a gunner. I don't think he gives you a whole lot of value receiver. So I think that's another thing to watch. But again, he's a kind of down the camp list when in the past we'd be talking about who's going to start at quarterback, who's going to start at receiver, and who's going to start at left tackle.
A lot of interesting questions for sure. We will address these in the coming weeks here as training camp continues. But, Scott, I know yesterday Coach Stefanski spoke to the media in preparation for the beginning of training camp and how they plan on handling things while adhering to a lot of the protocol that we've all kind of become accustomed to since the beginning of this pandemic. Well, what do we make of what was mentioned by Coach Stefanski yesterday?
Yeah, to me, Bull, it was, first of all, a balance of excitement. He mentioned how he looked out his second floor window And for the first time, right, the guy got the job in January. And for the first time, he saw players on the practice field. Now, they're only going out to do strength and conditioning, and then he was going to join the group for a walkthrough in the afternoon. But it's strange when you consider what, normally there'd be rookie mini camps, and there'd be OTAs, and then veteran mini camp. And this is the first time he's seeing his players in person, right? He hasn't even met all of them in person. He said with the rookies, and everybody's wearing a mask, it's hard to even tell who some of the rookies are because you haven't been around them enough. And that's just, again, a glimpse into our times. But we don't want to go too fast too soon. So when they have walkthroughs, they're not going to huddle. Everybody's going to wear a mask. They probably won't get a full team practice until August 14th, when they're permitted to have one August 12th. They're just going to be real slow. In fact, they're going to split the roster into 40 and 40 to, again, encourage social distancing, keep large groups out of the building. They're doing virtual meetings for the next week plus. All this to try to be as safe as possible early in this process when everyone reports back to camp from all over the country, because the Browns medical staff feels this is a critical time. And if you can limit any possible spread of the virus early in this, redefined season, and as you head into a training camp, they feel that's the key battle, is you kind of nip it in the bud before it gets a chance. So the Browns are being abundantly cautious. They're taking it slow. They don't want to force too much on the players too soon, especially when there was no off-season in person, right? But then you got to prepare for the season. So he's juggling a lot. The Browns have made a bunch of safety changes inside the building, the locker room. Now there's 40 guys instead of 90. There's plexiglass that goes from the ceiling almost to the floor. Everybody else is in the weight room. The weight room is now in the field house. So it's an interesting contrast to me of excited for football, and we're going to see it soon. And then you have, this is nowhere near a normal time, and how does everybody deal with it?
And that seems to be the million-dollar question. One, of course, not just facing the Browns, but it's facing everybody in the NFL. And, these next few weeks will certainly be very, very telling as to how they're able to conduct their business leading into the beginning of the season. And, Scott, it seems like things have calmed down a little bit, at least as far as the tension goes between the owners and the players. Does it seem to you like it's gotten at least a little bit better the last 6 or 7 days?
Yeah, it definitely has, Bull, and they came to an agreement. And J.C. Treader, the Browns center and the NFLPA president, wrote a column today for the union website, and he called it wins. He said, we won, and it was because we stuck together, and he pointed to everyday testing the first 2 weeks of training camp, which the players thought was vital. He pointed to no preseason games, which the league originally wanted at least 2, cut down from the normal 4. So I think the union got a couple of things it really felt was necessary to feel safe reporting back to work. And then they were able to make the money work. Now, the salary cap is going to dip, but it's not only going to dip in 2020, it's going to be spread out. So the players don't have to take a big hit in next year. Because if you took all the lost revenues and stuck it on the salary cap next year, players would be getting cut. There'd be veterans who have big-time contracts coming that might just be cut because it's feasibly impossible for the team to keep them on their roster. So the union feels like it got and I don't know if concessions are the right word, but the agreements from the owners where they think it's okay to come and play, and that includes opt-outs. So I think the fact that the NFL the NFL as a league wasn't as stubborn as Major League Baseball seemed to be, I think that is why we're looking at the chance for a season. Now, we've seen what's happened to baseball once they played outside a bubble, but there is a sense of cautious confidence that at least early in this process, the NFL will be able to carry on with some semblance of a season.
Cautious confidence. I love the alliteration, man. That's something I think we should say a few more times in future shows. All right, Scott, we're going to cut this one a little bit short today, but we can't end any of these podcasts without looking at your golf shot or golf shots of the week. So which one of your shots stood out this week?
Yeah, there weren't any great ones, Bull. I'm going to go with on Pleasant Valley number 8, which is a long par 4. Kind of hit a weak drive a little bit to the right, And then I was able to hit a 3-wood from wherever, 220. I choked down a little bit, so maybe it's 215, and hit it right at the flag to about 20 feet. That was a really good shot. In the effort of candor, I will say I 3-putted after that, so that was not ideal. And then there were a couple of long irons sprinkled in that I really liked on number one at Pleasant Valley. I had a really good long iron, the 5-iron, and was able to start off with a par after another kind of not great drive. So the game is taking a little bit of a step back after a couple really solid rounds. But I feel I'm close, and hopefully I'll get a couple more rounds in before we get training camp practice every day, and I'll have a couple of good rounds and even better shots to talk about.
And it looks like Mother Nature is going to cooperate with you, at least for this weekend. So hopefully you have a few more good shots to talk about next week. Scott, always a pleasure. Always a lot of fun to sit down and do these BrownZone.com zone coverage podcasts. We'll do this again next week as we get a little bit deeper into training camp.
Looking forward to it, but we should have plenty to talk about from here on out.
No doubt about it. Thank you, Scott. Again, that's Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and, of course, at BrownZone.com. That's going to wrap up today's edition of the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thank you again for tuning in, and we will talk to all of you again next week.